It's a little bit like if you're driving along the M1 in your car and you see that the petrol gauge is on low. So you sort of panic a bit and you think, I've got to fill up. So you pull into the petrol station, you open up the petrol cap, start to fill up, and then you realize actually the tank is full already. And the issue is that the petrol meter is broken. And this is the same with leptin resistance. So there's plenty of energy on board, but the petrol meter that the brain is reading shows empty. And this is why obese people will binge eat regularly.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
I'm here with Andrew Jenkinson. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure, Alex.
I just finished reading your book and I found it to be a very refreshing look at how to navigate the problem of nutrition and how to think about the obesity crisis as it stands currently. There does seem to be quite a significant disparity between the mainstream conversation around obesity, metabolic problems, nutrition, and a lot of the science which you so clearly describe in your book. And it seems obvious from national statistics that this is a problem so far that is only getting worse. And not only is it worse by itself, but it's also interacting with the COVID-19 pandemic, as you outline in a chapter of your book as well. So I'd love to dive into all of these topics with you. The first question I want to ask is, what motivated you to write this book? You already had an established career as a bariatric surgeon. And what compelled you then to make this sort of public statement and this deep dive into the science around obesity?
I became very intrigued as part of my job as a bariatric surgeon in this whole area of obesity. And the sort of question kept coming up in my mind: why would someone be in such a severe situation with obesity that they would come and ask for me to remove their stomach or bypass their stomach, when we know that, or when we're taught that weight loss is a very easy dynamic? Basically, you eat a little bit less, you exercise a little bit more until you start losing weight, and you continue doing that until you reach a regular natural weight, and then the problem's over. But in reality, it's much, much more difficult than that. Yes, certainly in the short term, patients who struggle with obesity can lose some weight, but in the long term, it seemed from my conversations and consultations with patients that it wasn't that easy at all, and that something else was going on that we didn't understand. I didn't think there was a sudden sort of mass problem with a population or a third of the population becoming weak-willed and lazy. I didn't sort of think it was a psychological problem. I thought maybe it was something to do with the environment, i.e. the food that we eat and the way that we live. So yeah, this sort of really inspired me and fascinated me. And I sort of spent 5 years doing a lot of reading around the area of metabolic regulation, how our bodies are designed to be a particular weight and how our bodies will defend that weight. I came across this sort of concept of the weight set point, which explained exactly what my patients have been telling me. Basically, yes, we can force our weight down transiently, but it will always go back up to the weight the body wants to be. And quite often that's an unhealthy weight. So the book is a sort of an expansion and explanation of the weight set point hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I could, as you started to do, I could lay out the mainstream case of obesity and maybe elaborate it a bit. And you can tell me why it's wrong.
Yeah.
So I think most people would say that being overweight and perhaps being obese is simply a case of eating too many calories, not exercising enough. We do live in a more sedentary society now than we ever have before, particularly in terms of the macronutrients, the fats, the carbohydrates, and the protein. Fats are the most calorie dense, and fats, of course, as we know, clog our arteries and lead to things like heart disease. And really, if we want to lose weight, what we have to do is eat significantly less, particularly less fat, because it is so calorie dense. And in terms of exercise, we need to do particularly cardio, because cardio is the form of exercise which burns the most calories. And ideally, we should also eat less salt, because salt can affect our blood pressure. So why is that wrong?
That's a really good summary, Alex, of current mainstream thinking about weight regulation and obesity. So the first point is the energy in, energy out. So the calories taken in by eating and calories expended by exercise. And the simplified understanding that, this is the ultimate cause of weight gain. The energy sort of in out balance is obviously very important. I mean, you can't gain weight without taking in more energy than you use. But our bodies are able to manipulate the amount of energy that we expend in order to either save energy if we're losing too much weight, or actually, more commonly, to expend a lot of more energy than we need just to get rid of excess calories. So this sort of really dynamic alteration in the amount of energy that we burn, and this is our basal metabolism, so the amount of energy that we burn without taking into account movement, is a really important and sort of overlooked and misunderstood factor in whether someone's going to be able to lose weight or whether they gain weight. And we know from a lot of quite often historical research, which shows that if you take a group of people who are the same age and the same sex and the same size, and you measure their basal metabolic rate, so the amount of energy that they use every day without moving before they move, that's actually accounts for about 70% of our energy expenditure. So it is a big bulk of our energy expenditure we have at zero, control of. But if you take sort of a group of people and you look at the range, the normal range, so excluding, the 5% sort of under metabolizers and the 5% over metabolizers, if you look at the range, it probably encompasses about 700 kilocalories. So someone under lower range compared to someone normal upper range, the difference would be 700 kilocalories per day. And this is the same as a 10K run, or more than a 10K run, or a large 3-course meal, or really going for it in McDonald's or some fast food restaurant. So there are massive differences between people who appear the same size and shape. And this, again, is sort of borne out by a lot of what my patients did tell me, in that they would say when they moved in with a friend, when they were at university or whatever, they observed that their friend could eat a lot more than them, and their friend was slim. And these are sort of, these comments are sort of dismissed a little bit by mainstream thinking. But when you look into the evidence behind them, they actually are probably, there's a great element of truth in them. So that's the first area that you mentioned, the energy in, energy out. Yes, that is important, but the energy out is very dynamic and not under our control. We may think we can control it by going to the gym now and again, but it's sort of that control is minimal compared to the amount of control the body has. Another example would be, if we look at the amount of energy that our population as a whole has eaten compared to 30 years ago, we now eat 500 kilocalories per day more per person than 30 years ago. If you simply put that into the equation of 500 kilocalories extra in per day, we should be putting on something like, I think, 4 stone per person per year. And clearly that's not happening. The population's getting bigger by a pound or 0.5 kilograms per year. Obviously, over 20 or 30 years, that's quite a problem. That's why the populations are now becoming morbidly obese. But if we took into account the actual amount of calories that we're expending, that we're putting in, then the figures don't add up. So this sort of our metabolic adaptation can actually burn that extra energy, and this is sort of explained in the book by effects on our sympathetic nervous system. So we'll get tachycardia, our heart will beat faster, our blood pressures will be high, and we will be there'll be activity on our muscles which can turn chemical energy into thermal energy. It's called an uncoupling reaction in the ATP. So all of these things can expend the excess calories that we take in. When we go on a diet, or we're sick, or we're in a situation where there was a famine and our calorie intake is limited, then again the body adapts. So our parasympathetic nervous system comes into play, and that becomes much more active. Our blood pressure goes down, our pulse goes down, and we become colder. And our basal metabolic rate becomes less. And so you can have a person who, for instance, will diet and go on 1,200 kilocalories a day and lose some weight for the first 2-3 weeks. But then their body adapts, and that's all they're burning. They're feeling sluggish, they're feeling, irritable. They don't want to get out of bed because their parasympathetic nervous system has taken over. So they're not expending anything. So this is why diets, only work in the short term. We're very good at, adapting to either overeating or undereating in order to maintain what our bodies think is a healthy weight, and what is explained in the book as the weight set point. So that's sort of the initial energy in, energy out sort of equation. The fact it's a little bit more complex than that simple equation. You then spoke about how we have the three macronutrients: fat, carbohydrates, and protein, and how we have this historical understanding from scientists that fat clogs up our arteries and causes heart disease, and also secondarily, it's very dense in calories. So the mainstream advice for many years has been, in order to reduce weight, you need to cut those calories in fat, and as a secondary effect of that, that's going to improve your cardiac risk. Again, if you look into the research, which is explained in the book, in part 2 of the book, there was a big scientific debate in the 1960s between whether sugar or saturated fat caused the increase in heart disease that we were seeing at the time. And the fat lobby won, as it were, via a guy called Ansel Keys, but a lot of that research has subsequently been proved to be flawed. But because we had, many years of, the whole population understanding that, saturated fat causes heart disease, it's really difficult now to tell the population actually that's totally wrong. And sugar is, a much more damaging from a cardiovascular point of view, as well as from a weight point of view. So we, historically, we advised our populations to stop eating saturated fat. We told the food companies to remove saturated fat from foods and replace it with low-fat options. And those changes coincided with obesity increasing significantly in the 1980s. There has been a decrease in the rate of heart disease, but the rate of smoking has decreased significantly, and our treatment of heart disease and the prophylactic treatment to prevent things coming, like the treatment of hypertension, for instance, has improved substantially, and that would, I think, explain the reduction in heart disease and not the reduction in saturated fat that the populations eat. When you look at actually what foods cause weight gain, I think there is a consensus that sugar and carbohydrates are the sort of main culprits. And the book explains that it's not specifically the calories in those foods, it's what the food does to your hormonal balance. And I'm sure a lot of the listeners have heard a lot about insulin, but the more sugar and carbohydrate you consume, the higher your average levels of insulin throughout the day and week. We know as doctors that if we treat someone with insulin for diabetes, they will put weight on. They will, within a few weeks, they'll put a stone on or 2 stone. And so the book explains that, the Western diet, which is infused with sugar and refined carbohydrate like wheat, is almost acting like a proxy drug to increase our insulin levels. And the secondary effect of that is weight gain with the population. But the smokescreen is that, sugar has got a lot of calories as well. And mainstream understanding is it's the calories that are causing the weight gain. It's not. It's the fact that the insulin levels in your your average insulin levels are shifted upwards, and that insulin is an anabolic hormone. It causes, weight gain and growth. So yeah, this was the ultimate cause of the increase in obesity rates in the 80s. So much more consumption of sugar and refined carbohydrates and less of saturated fat.
And I guess the additional problem is, by targeting fat, not only are you missing sugar as one of the main drivers, but fat is actually a very important part of your diet, because fat is the basis of our nervous system and a lot of our hormones. So actually, if you eat no fat or very little fat, you can get very, very sick.
Yeah, that's correct. And one of the replacements, apart from sugar and refined carbohydrates of saturated fat, was the slightly newly discovered food called vegetable oil. And this is again explained in the book as it's metabolically quite damaging to us as well as humans. So the book explains that we have there's three particular types of fat class. So there's monounsaturated fats, such as olive oil. There's saturated fats, such as butter, lard, and ghee, and the saturated fat within meat, red meat. And then in between is polyunsaturated fats, and these are vegetable oils. And in nature, polyunsaturated sort of fatty acids are, there's two particular types that are very, very important to us because every other fat we can make in our bodies without consuming it, such as cholesterol and whatever. But there are two particular types of fat that we can't make within our body. And they're the omega fatty acids, so omega-3 and omega-6 particularly. And we're reliant on taking those in within our diet. And so the book explains that, when we eat a lot less fresh foods, which contain a lot of omega-3, such as, your greens and, fresh meats and fresh fish and things like that, we're reducing our omega-3 levels. And when we eat a lot of processed foods, which is very stable and can last for a long time, and, you can put it on the supermarket shelf, those foods are infused with omega-6 fatty acids, so vegetable oils, basically. Every cell on our bodies has a space for omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids on our cell membranes. And the ratio of the two is very important in a lot of factors, including insulin signaling and inflammation. The more omega-6 you have as a ratio in your diet, the more inflammation you're going to get in your body. It's a pro-inflammatory fatty acid. And also the more you're going to struggle with insulin resistance. So the insulin won't work as well because the cell membrane is not processing the insulin as well. So as well as sugar and refined carbohydrates in the Western diet causing obesity, also the shift towards vegetable oils as the main fat has totally disrupted our omega-3/6 profile ratio. And that secondarily, again, causes changes to our internal sort of hormonal homeostasis, with the secondary effect that our weight set points, where our body wants our weight to be, is shifted upwards, and then we just put weight on.
So we've got a diet with too many carbohydrates, which is causing higher than normal insulin levels, which obviously causes a degree of weight gain. And we've got an unfavorable ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. That is to say, too much omega-6 in relative to omega-3. And what that does is it makes the body more insulin resistant.
Yes.
So too much insulin plus insulin resistance, and that leads to an elevation of the body weight set point. Is that right?
Yeah. And the reason for that is, so we get onto another hormone now that regulates our weight on a sort of over a long term, and that's called leptin. So leptin is a hormone that is produced by our fat cells and acts as a signal to our hypothalamus, which is the ultimate controller of our weight in our brain. It acts as a signal to how much fat we have on board, so how much energy storage we have, for times when there may be a famine or whatever in the future. So the more fat you have, the more leptin is produced, and the higher that leptin signal, and the hypothalamus can sense it's sort of okay, we can take it easy this week with food, and we can expend a load of energy or increase our metabolic rate. Conversely, when we lose fat, if we're sick or we've been dieting or we're in a famine situation, the leptin signal will go down, and the hypothalamus will change our behavior and introduce sort of food-seeking behavior and decrease our metabolism. So leptin is very important in that long-term homeostasis negative feedback loop, which many people who don't struggle with weight problems, they don't have to count calories. Leptin is doing the job for them. So if, they've been a little bit sick or they lost a little bit of weight, they will be made hungry. If they've been on holiday and overdone it and put on 2 or 3 kilograms, the body will sense that, a little bit too much fat on board. A lot of people can try and lose their holiday weight gain by going to the gym and going on a diet, but actually the hypothalamus will do it anyway. So leptin is really, really important. So what goes wrong with obese people? Why isn't leptin working? And when you look at the function of it, it gets disrupted by insulin. So at the hypothalamic level, both insulin and leptin have the same receptor. They join to the same receptor within the hypothalamus. So if there's too much insulin around, the leptin signal gets diluted. So despite having a massive amount of energy on board and massive high leptin levels in morbidly obese people, they also have very high insulin levels, and that leptin is not seen. This is called leptin resistance. And the analogy in the book is, it's a little bit like if you're driving along the M1 in your car and you see that the petrol gauge is on low, it's on red. So you sort of panic a bit and you think, I've got to fill up. So you pull into the petrol station, you open up the petrol cap, start to fill up, and then you realize actually the tank is full already. And the issue is that the petrol meter is broken. And this is the same with leptin resistance. So there's plenty of energy on board, but the petrol meter that the brain is reading shows empty. And this is why obese people will binge eat regularly. There's a lot of psychological aspects that people think, why are obese people binge eating? They tend to do it in secret because it's embarrassing. They'll do it at night or whatever when there's no family members around, but they will consume, hundreds and hundreds of extra calories or thousands of extra calories per day, not because of, any psychological problem, but because they have severe leptin resistance and they're getting those signals, those ravenous food-seeking behavior signals from the hypothalamus. Now, that sort of explains binge eating a little bit, but obviously once you have those signals for a period of time and the food that is available to you is Western food, then you do develop an element of addiction to that food. So we know, you guys will know, that particularly sugar has a similar receptor that is stimulated as opiates. Vegetable oil-containing foods such as fast foods and processed foods are precursors to cannabinoids. So all of these are slightly addictive. They're foods that cause us to feel, in a way, various different receptors in our brain make us feel good. So the drive from leptin resistance is to eat calories. If the calories available in our Western high street happen to be, from addictive foods, highly likely that you're going to get a little bit addicted to that food as well.
Do you think at that point then psychological problems can manifest themselves? Because, an addictive behavior can be such a natural refuge when someone is feeling stressed or someone feels like they're in an emotionally fragile position. And then the binge eating not only is there the physiological drive from the leptin resistance, which you explained, but also the binge is kind of like almost like a safe harbor from the world and addiction, much like a drug addiction.
Yeah, I mean, if you can imagine being severely obese, the effect, and also being severely obese and doctors and scientists and the general public and the media and you having this understanding that it's the problem because of you, it's nothing else. It's because you choose to eat too many calories and you don't exercise enough. And you look massive and people in the street will look at you and blame you. You imagine the effect on your self-esteem and confidence. I certainly know that the patients that I see, at least half of them are on antidepressants. And they're driven to food by leptin resistance, but actually food becomes a very big comfort for them, for an antidepressant in itself. This is why actually you have to be very careful when we do bariatric surgery on people, which automatically will make the leptin work a little bit better and reduce their weight set point substantially. But we have to be careful because a lot of people, food has become their friend. and we're taking that away. So all bariatric units will have, a full-time bariatric psychologist to help people through those times.
Mm-hmm. And is it also fair to say that the high insulin levels prevent, my understanding is that when insulin levels are high, natural processes of lipolysis can't take place, processes where fats would be broken down to provide steady energy throughout the day. When someone's insulin levels are low, simply those processes can't take place when when insulin is present at all. Is that right?
Yes, and this is why, the constant sort of grazing and snacking behavior that we've developed, constantly, we constantly have a level of insulin. So, it's very difficult for fat to be broken down.
Yeah, I've often thought of obesity. It's like, because obviously, among other things, fat is an energy storage mechanism. And I've often thought of obesity like having $1 million in a safe, which you can't open. And you're just kind of carrying it around with you all the time. You don't have access to the value that it can provide. And I guess we can now get on to what we can call practical steps or solutions. How do you start to access your fat storage for the energy that it can provide?
So I think, the book goes through some ideas for trying to reduce your weight set point. I sort of didn't really want to make it a book about, what to do. I just wanted to explain, the weight set point and the history of our food. But the publishers were very keen to put in a section at the end about advice.
I suppose what I liked about the advice that you give is it is principles based.
Yeah.
So it's less, do this exact thing, and it's more, these are the principles around which you should structure your lifestyle, which is obviously a lot more flexible, but it's also a lot more empowering, because it allows the person to, embody and internalize those principles and then construct essentially a program that works for them, rather than many diet books which give the exactitudes of what you should do and the minutiae, which is really a fragile setup. It's really a setup for failure, because you either do this exact thing or you fail. So it becomes very easy to fail in that kind of paradigm.
Yeah, the book explains that. The first part is just to understand that it's not directly the calories that cause the weight gain. It's what the food does to your body. So if you understand that, you don't have to, worry about going hungry because you're starving yourself. If you change the type of food that you eat, it will improve insulin. It will improve omega-3/6 profile. If you improve the way you relax and sleep, it'll improve your cortisol profile as well. These three things will reduce your weight setting. And the simple rules are, the first one is obviously to give up or to cut down substantially on sugar and refined carbohydrates. The second one is to do a little bit of exercise that you enjoy, at least 3 times a week. And probably muscular exercise is pretty good, probably better than aerobic exercise. And the sort of preconception about going to the gym and things is that you burn off those calories and that's how you lose weight. But actually, good muscular and aerobic exercise as well improves insulin function massively and decreases our stress hormone cortisol. So I think that the main effect of weight loss going to the gym is through the improvement in these hormones. We know that when you go to the gym, you just feel hungry afterwards, you have to refuel. But over the long term, people lose weight, which is why gyms haven't gone away. It's not purely running those calories off.
So you shouldn't think about the gym as I'm going to the gym to burn off, let's say, 500 calories, but rather it's I'm going to improve my metabolic machinery, particularly if you're lifting weights and actually putting on muscle mass.
Yeah.
That presumably would increase your basal metabolic rate. Just the amount of calories you'd need just to be alive would increase favorably.
Yeah, and I think just a healthy muscle mass is good for, even if you overeat, it's much more likely you're able to, your body can, ratchet up that basal metabolism. Whereas if you very, very sedentary, you will get a degree of sarcopenia where your muscle mass does start to shrink. And then if that's combined with overeating, it's very difficult for the body to burn off those calories.
Mm-hmm. And particularly a problem, this is diverging a little bit from the problem of obesity, but what happens with elderly people is that they tend to have much lower bone densities. And my understanding, that's correlated with muscle mass. And of course, once you have that really low bone density, that's why for elderly people, a fall is potentially a really traumatic instance where you might break a hip. And if you break a hip and end up in hospital, and you don't have a very strong cardiorespiratory reserve because you don't do any aerobic exercise, and then you get pneumonia, you see how all these problems compound each other and can lead to a very vulnerable elderly population.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so I'm increasingly, when I talk to patients, across the age spectrum, but particularly as they're getting older, I am advocating a lot more for strength and resistance training. And in terms of the cardio, I find walking is one of the most, superior methods because it doesn't fatigue you. It's enjoyable. You can do other things while you're walking. You can talk to a friend, or you can listen to a podcast or something like that. And you can, like improve insulin functioning, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm not sure about walking. I mean, my instinct is that it's a bit overrated. A lot of my patients tell me they're doing the 10,000 steps a day. When you look into the research around 10,000 steps a day, there's nothing there. It's just some sort of myth that's, there's a myth that if you walk 10,000 steps a day, you're going to lose weight. Yeah, you will be a lot fitter and you probably will lose a little bit of weight. But that time, that hour and a half, 2 hours it takes to walk 10,000 steps, actually, if you utilize that time by going to the gym or going to the tennis club or whatever, or the squash club, it would be much better for you. So I don't think walking is bad at all, but it takes a long time. Some people, if they're older, there's nothing much else they can do, and maybe brisk walking up a hill and to get a sweat up and things is okay, but a sort of leisurely stroll probably is better for the mind than the body. But as if it improves your cortisol level, that's good. So the other areas in the book to reduce your weight setting, where we talked about cortisol. So again, this is a drug. If I treated you with corticosteroids for autoimmune disease or something, you would put on a couple of stone within a few weeks, probably without any conscious control. You just become much more hungry. Again, the way we live in the Western world does increase our low-grade levels of stress. And also we have, I think, as a population, quite a significant problem with sleep deprivation. And all of these things, I think, contribute to increased stress. But again, if you go to the gym, if you exercise, that stress level will decrease. The final part of the final, probably very important part of the advice to reduce your weight setting is in regard to the omega-3 and 6 profile. So, actually just start cooking healthy, unprocessed foods and eating 2 or 3 meals a day and not snacking between meals. That's going to have a massive beneficial effect on your omega-3, 6 profile, your insulin function, and your general health. And without going on any diet, you'll start to see weight. You gain much healthier weight if you struggle with your weight beforehand.
You, in the book, you outlined all those principles, and you also mentioned that other methods people use, such as tracking calories, measuring your weight on a scale, you kind of dismiss those. You think perhaps that they do more harm than good. My question is, if you make a distinction, because I suppose there are people who are at different points on the spectrum in terms of losing weight. There are people, for example, who are obese and they want to get down to a reasonably healthy weight. There are people who are mildly overweight and they want to lose weight. There are people who want to achieve quite, frankly, like specific aesthetics in terms of their body. And my question is, having employed those lifestyle measures that you mentioned, more sleep, healthier food, fresh food, a more favorable omega-3 to omega-6 profile, do you think there might be a place for people who want to achieve a particularly good physique for calorie tracking and using your body weight to be a bit more precise? And really the reason I bring this up is because I've followed quite closely a lot of bodybuilding literature, and see how they can quite predictably do what they call bulks and cuts. They can predictably gain or lose weight to achieve specific physiques. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I don't think there's any big problem with tracking your calories. You probably get a better understanding if you're really into it of your basal metabolism and how it reacts to calorific deficits, and whether you need to sort of ratchet up the exercise a little bit more. So I don't have any big issue with people tracking calories and weight. But if you sort of employed those lifestyle changes in the book, then the weight will just come off automatically.
Yeah. The lifestyle changes would be the primary driver.
Clearly there's some people who, they won't lose as much weight with a change in the look because their lifestyle is actually not too bad already, and maybe just a couple of things. But people who, have a terrible lifestyle, so a lot of sugar and wheat and processed foods, we know those people are going to lose a lot of weight, just not by going on a diet, but just by tidying up their food, basically.
And the other thing, frankly, is, and I'm really talking about myself, I do think there is such a thing as gluttony. Like, I do think you can eat enough so that you're not craving excess food, but you just eat past that level of fullness anyway. I've noticed that in myself, and for that reason, I've found calorie tracking just as a kind of guide to roughly how much I should eat quite helpful.
I think we're sort of hardwired a little bit to take in more calories than we really need, just like we take in more water than we really need every day. So we're hardwired for that. We're able to expend extra energy. I think if we do it a lot, if we sort of overeat really, really regularly, this is where we may get a problem with blood pressure. As the body's trying to control the weight, we're overeating, and our blood pressure may suffer because of that. And you speak to any cardiologist, and the best treatment of blood pressure is to go on a low calorie diet. Blood pressure will go down immediately.
And I did, bring up salt at the very beginning, knowing I don't think that the relationship between salt and blood pressure or metabolic problems is very scientifically sound. But can you comment on that? Is salt something we should be worrying about?
I sort of can't really comment on it, so I didn't really go into that in the book. From a personal perspective, I have no issues with salt. I think if you have high blood pressure, again, I didn't really do a great deal of reading about salt and blood pressure, but I would suspect, probably not take in excess salt if you have high blood pressure. But otherwise, I would think, they don't have any big advice on that.
What do you think are some of the psychological pitfalls that people can fall into when they're trying to change their lifestyle?
I think people get into their own habits, and sometimes those are unhealthy habits, and you will know better than me, but those habits sort of spark nice dopamine, serotonin responses. They make people feel good. And, in this day and age, after lockdown for a year, it's sort of like, comfort foods and Netflix. This is a habit that most of the population has got into. It's quite a nice habit, but it's not very healthy. So I think breaking bad habits and, getting into good habits can be difficult at first. And again, it's not my area. It's more of, behavioral psychology. But I think, that can be a big pitfall. But the more they understand about, the pathways of why you have this bad habit and why it makes you feel so good, and what to do, if you sort of have a wave of craving to do that thing, just let that wave go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting to think of habits more and more like our underlying operating system. And a book that changed my mind about this or influenced me about this is called Atomic Habits, and it's how to remove unhealthy habits and how to program more helpful habits. And what I've found is, so if you want to program something in your life, normally it will take a lot of motivation and energy at the beginning. Say you want to go to the gym regularly, but the more you do it, the less your motivation is particularly required or necessary. Like, you're not motivated to brush your teeth in the morning. You just brush your teeth because that's what you do. You've always done it. There's very little risk that you're not going to brush your teeth on any given day. And similarly, I find if you've gone to the gym, most days for 6 months, month 7, it's not that you necessarily wake up feeling particularly motivated every time. You might feel motivated sometimes, but it just becomes the thing that you do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I think the other trap I worry that people fall into is that, and this applies to much more than weight, this kind of from the psychoanalytic literature, but I think people construct an idealized version of themselves when they want to achieve something. So they want to take up the piano, for instance, they picture themselves, as the next Chopin or something like that. Then they humbly try and make efforts to learn the piano. And when they inevitably fail to live up to that quite unrealistic idealization, they classify themselves as a failure. And I think similarly with weight loss, when someone starts a weight loss program, they picture themselves as like ripped with abs on the beach. And as they might make really good sound progress, but because they don't match up to that image of themselves, they still see themselves as a failure. And then that, causes a spiral back to the old habits and the old problems.
Yeah. And this sort of misunderstanding of why calorie restriction per se is sort of bound for failure. If you don't understand that, then you're going to blame yourselves. But yeah, I think realistic expectations is important. So if someone's quite overweight and in their 50s, they're not going to get back to the weight they were when they were a teenager, even with good habits. A lot of these reality TV shows, like The Biggest Losers, which are mentioned in the book, are really damaging to people's perception of what is realistic, because those shows just look at a specific period of time, 2-3 months in a boot camp, with fantastic results. But when you look at the evidence of what happens to these participants 5-6 years later, most of them have put most of the weight on again or more. But, just focusing on that short-term thing, like, oh, this person's been to a boot camp for 2-3 months, their life has changed, really sort of drills this sort of level of guilt even further into people that they can't do it and it's their fault.
Mm-hmm. And it also strikes me that we focus on weight as the primary goal, like literally the number.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make very much sense, because even if you're taking the ultra vain aesthetic point of view, you're not really chasing a number. You're chasing body composition. You're chasing what's the ratio of muscle to fat at any given point in time, which body weight can be helpful as a proxy, but it can be like notoriously unreliable. Like you can have a very good body composition and still be classified as overweight with an overweight BMI, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, BMI assumes that your body is of normal composition. So if you have a particular muscular body, then your BMI may be in the overweight or obese category, but you don't have much body fat. It's just the way the BMI is designed. Again, if you have not much fat, you can be fat, but be within the normal BMI range. So yeah, it's limited, but we sort of have to understand it's based on an average body composition.
One thing I wanted to talk to you about was more on a societal level. I come from Malta, which is a country Boris Johnson recently outed as famously being very bad at managing our levels of obesity. We have some of the highest levels of obesity, both in adults and children in Europe, with 68% of our adult men in the overweight or obese range, for instance. Now, it was interesting because I was looking at some statistics and comparing them to the things you described in your book. And despite our high levels of obesity, we have very low levels of saturated fat intake. My question is, what if you were part of the sort of government administration and you had to make sort of more societal recommendations for people in terms of how should they eat? What kind of policies might you think about? And is there any data that we should be collecting that we're not, like, for example, omega-3 to omega-6 ratios in individuals?
I mean, it can be measured, the omega-3/6 ratio in individuals, but it's not mainstream, the fact that this disruption has caused obesity. So my book lays out, what governments potentially could do. The first thing is they won't do anything until they understand the problem. They understand that it's the quality of the food available to a population that causes that population or a subset of that population to become obese, sick, and unhappy. It's not to do with the population's psyche or,
Lack of willpower.
lack of willpower. It's to do with, the quality of the food, so the processed and industrialized food available to that population. If they understand that, then they may be more prone to thinking about taxing, I would say, quite heavily that type of food. Maybe even put warnings rather than just calories, but warnings about it. The tax revenues could then be channeled to making healthy foods, so vegetables, meat, fish, dairy products, much cheaper. And also, some of the money could be channeled to a public education campaign, maybe encouraging or regenerating food culture in the country. So, the joy of cooking, teach people how to cook, the joy of socializing around food, this sort of thing, and having food and cooking as a real central pillar to the way we live, not only from a physical, but also from an emotional and psychological happiness point of view. But if governments don't understand the problem, then they won't do that.
Since you've discovered more about these principles of metabolic health and started to implement them in your practice, have you noticed a difference in terms of how patients can take them on board, the ease with which they can take them on board as opposed to low-calorie dieting? And have you noticed that you've been able to avoid doing surgeries where previously you might have had to perform bariatric surgery?
So this is sort of mentioned in the book that the book is designed for people who are overweight, really. Well, it's designed for anyone who's interested in weight regulation. So popular science, a lot of people are interested in this area as it does affect our country significantly. But as far as sort of helping people to not become obese, it's for those people who are overweight who would consider normally going on, every 6 months, quite a stringent, basically low-calorie diet. It explains why, that actually is counterproductive and makes things worse. And to not do that, but actually to, start cooking food, start eating proper food, stop snacking, to moderate amount of exercise that you enjoy. If you go to a level of the patient who comes to my clinic, so they're morbidly obese, their body mass index can be 40, 45, 50. These people have, quite severe leptin resistance already. They will lose weight, with the lifestyle and dietary changes outlined in the book, but maybe not enough or fast enough for them to get back into a modicum of health. So this is where bariatric surgery for these particular people who have sort of gone too far, they've been dieting their whole lives. Bariatric surgery is a very safe and effective tool, to reset their weights to a much, much healthier level. And these people come back full of confidence, really, really happy with a new lease of life.
So I guess once they reach that point where the endocrinological system is sufficiently distorted, then it becomes a much more viable solution to their difficulties. Or I suppose a first step, which then can be followed by the lifestyle changes which you recommend.
Yeah, exactly. So anyone who's had bariatric surgery, I would certainly advise that they stick to those. That's what I advise, that they stick to healthy unprocessed foods.
Before you learned all this about these metabolic principles, did you find that patients post-surgery, your patients, had a harder time because they wouldn't have these principles to fall back on?
Yeah, I sort of tended to leave that type of advice to the dietitians. So yeah, before I started sort of getting more interested in it. I mean, I definitely had, as most people do, including most doctors, quite a big prejudice, subconscious prejudice against the obese, because I didn't understand the problem. But, I got just totally intrigued by this question, because all the stories that the obese people, patients, were telling me were very similar. Yeah, I can lose weight, but I put it back on. I think I've got a low metabolism. I think it's, genetic. In my family, we're all big. All of these things just kept on coming up and coming up and coming up. They go against, our popular beliefs, but, patients weren't colluding. They were trying to tell me something. So that's what the book is based upon.
Yeah, and of course, it doesn't mean that things like discipline and hard work and willpower don't matter or don't have an influence. But what you're saying is clearly when 2/3 of the population are suffering incredibly from this kind of problem with all of these repeated patterns. And like you say, it does tend to run in families. And I talked to Robert Plomin on my last podcast, who's a geneticist, and he said that genetic studies indicate that body weight is 70% heritable, which of course is not to say that the environment doesn't matter, but some genetics clearly predispose, if combined with a Western diet, to the obesity issue.
Yeah, so that's sort of outlined in, I think, chapter 2 of the book as well. Around about a 70% correlation between, your genetics and your BMI. But the trigger of becoming obese has to be, the Western way we live. So highly processed industrialized foods, less fresh foods, more snacking, less sleep, more stress. That's the issue.
Great. So we've covered a lot. I think we've captured the main thrust of the book. I would encourage everyone to read it. Congratulations for being the first surgeon on this very psychiatrist-dominated podcast, but it was very nice to hear your refreshing and informative take on this subject. Is there anything else you want to add before you sign off?
Just thanks for showing an interest, Alex, and great questions, actually. Really enjoyable.
And where can people get the book?
From any good booksellers, plus Tesco and Amazon. And actually, the audio is very, very popular. And
I listened to the audio actually, and I really liked it.
Good. Thanks, Alex. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend or give us a rating. It really does help people to find us. If you find the podcast valuable, why not buy us a coffee to help keep us going? There's a link in the show notes. As ever, we love to hear from you and love to hear what you think. So drop us an email or get in touch on social media. Thank you so much.